The boxcar smelled of sweat and fear and the slow decay of hope. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka pressed his back against the wooden wall and listened to the rhythm of iron wheels on American rails. 37 men shared this darkness with him. Some prayed in whispers. Some had stopped speaking days ago. None of them expected to survive. 6 weeks had passed since his capture on Attu Island in the Aleutians. The battle had been a slaughter. Of the 2,900 Japanese soldiers who defended that frozen rock, only 28 were taken alive. The rest had charged into American machine guns during a final banzai attack, choosing death over the shame of surrender. Kenji had been unconscious when they found him, buried under the bodies of his squad, a piece of shrapnel lodged in his thigh. He had not chosen to live. Fate had chosen for him. His commanding officer's final words echoed in his memory like a curse. Americans torture prisoners. They cut off fingers. They burn flesh. They make death last for weeks. Every man in this boxcar believed those words. The train had been moving for 3 days now. They had crossed mountains, plains, and rivers Kenji could not name. Guards brought water twice daily but rarely spoke. When the prisoners asked where they were going, the guards shrugged or smiled or said nothing at all. This uncertainty was its own form of torture. Kenji understood that much about psychology. Before the war, he had studied literature at Waseda University in Tokyo. He had read Hemingway, Steinbeck, and Faulkner. He had loved America through its books. Now he was inside America, and he could not reconcile the country of those stories with the monster his propaganda had described. Beside him, Sergeant Yamamoto sat rigid and silent. Yamamoto was 43 years old, a career soldier who had fought in China before Pearl Harbor. He had seen things he refused to discuss. His brother had been captured on Wake Island in December 1941. 3 months later, Yamamoto received a letter informing him his brother had died in American custody. No explanation. No body. Just a form letter with an official stamp. Since that day, Yamamoto had been waiting to die. He did not fear torture. He welcomed it. Suffering was the only honorable path remaining. The train lurched and slowed. Brakes screamed. The prisoners tensed. Young Private Sato grabbed Kenji's arm. Sato was 19, the youngest among them, captured during the same battle. He had cried every night for the first week. Now his eyes were dry but empty. Whatever had lived inside him was fading. Light exploded into the boxcar as the door slid open. Kenji squinted against the blazing Texas sun. Heat poured in like liquid fire. They were stopped at a small platform surrounded by flat brown land that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Armed guards stood along the tracks, but they did not raise their rifles. They looked bored. One of them was chewing something and blowing bubbles. A young American private climbed into the boxcar carrying a crate. He set it down and began pulling out canteens. Water. The private smiled at the prisoners. He had freckles and red hair and looked no older than Sato. He said something in English. Kenji translated the words in his mind. Hot day, fellas. Drink up. Nobody moved. This was a trick. The water was poisoned. The kindness was a weapon. Yamamoto hissed a warning. But Sato was already reaching. His hand trembled as he took a canteen. He unscrewed the cap and drank deeply. The other prisoners watched him. They waited for him to choke, to scream, to die. Sato lowered the canteen. Water dripped down his chin. He was still alive. One by one, the others took canteens. Kenji drank last. The water was cold and clean and tasted like nothing he had ever known. He felt tears building behind his eyes but forced them down. Crying was weakness. Weakness was shame. The American private collected the empty canteens and jumped down from the boxcar. Before the door closed, he turned back and gave a small wave. "See you in Texas," he said. The darkness returned. The train began moving again. Kenji sat in silence, trying to understand what had just happened. The propaganda said Americans were savages. The propaganda said they would suffer. But a freckled boy had given them water and smiled. It meant nothing. It had to mean nothing, and yet, Kenji remembered a line from Hemingway, from a book he had read in a Tokyo cafe a lifetime ago: "The world breaks everyone and afterward many are strong at the broken places." He had not understood those words then. He was beginning to understand them now. Something inside him was breaking. He did not know yet whether he would be strong in the broken places or simply shattered beyond repair. The train carried them deeper into Texas. The prisoners sat in darkness and waited for whatever came next. Some prayed for death. Some prayed for mercy. Kenji prayed for nothing at all. He had stopped believing prayers were answered the day his entire squad died on a frozen island at the edge of the world, but somewhere in his chest, beneath the fear and shame, a small flame flickered. It was not hope. Not yet. It was something smaller. A question. A crack in everything he thought he knew: what kind of enemy gives water to the men he should hate? The gates of Camp Hearn opened like the mouth of some great beast, and Kenji Tanaka walked into a world that made no sense. He had prepared himself for barbed wire and guard towers, for attack dogs and rifles aimed at his heart. Those things existed here. But so did something else. A baseball diamond. Vegetable gardens. Japanese prisoners walking freely in the Texas sun without chains on their ankles. Kenji stopped walking. A guard nudged him forward with the butt of a rifle, but gently, almost apologetically. The camp spread before him in neat rows of wooden barracks painted white. American flags snapped in the hot wind. And everywhere, prisoners moved with a calm that bordered on impossible. Some played cards in the shade. Others tended tomato plants. A group near the fence was singing a folk song from Osaka. Camp Hearn had been built in 1942 on 500 acres of Texas farmland. It held nearly 5,000 prisoners at its peak, mostly Germans from Rommel's Afrika Korps, but a smaller compound housed Japanese soldiers captured in the Pacific. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment. Colonel Marcus Webb, the camp commander, believed in going further. He had been a cattle rancher before the war. He understood that broken men produced nothing. So he fed his prisoners well. He let them work. He treated them like human beings, and in return, he received something the military rarely achieved: compliance without cruelty. Kenji did not trust it. Neither did Yamamoto. During their first week, Yamamoto organized secret meetings in the barracks. He spoke of resistance, of honor, of dying with dignity rather than accepting enemy kindness. The Americans wanted something, he argued. This comfort was manipulation. They would extract information through softness when torture failed. Kenji listened but said nothing. He watched the guards. He studied their faces. He searched for the hatred he had been promised, that he found it in some. A corporal named Henderson spat at prisoners when officers were not watching. A sergeant from Alabama called them animals under his breath. But others were different. There was Billy Dawson. Billy was 19 years old, the son of a rancher from a town so small it did not appear on most maps. He had enlisted after Pearl Harbor because his father told him it was the right thing to do. He had never left Texas before basic training. He had never met a Japanese person before Camp Hearn. Everything he knew about the enemy came from newsreels and newspapers and the fury of neighbors who had lost sons in the Pacific. He had arrived at camp ready to hate, but hate required distance, and guard duty offered none. Billy watched the prisoners eat, sleep, laugh, and weep. He saw young men who looked like the farmhands he had grown up beside. He saw old men who reminded him of his grandfather. He saw fear that mirrored his own. One evening, Billy found Kenji sitting alone near the fence, writing in a small notebook. Billy's orders prohibited conversation with prisoners, but something made him stop. Kenji looked up. Their eyes met. "You speak English?" Billy asked. Kenji nodded. "I studied at university. Before the war." Billy glanced around to confirm no officers were watching. "What are you writing?" "Letters. To my family. They will never receive them. But I write anyway." Billy did not know what to say. He had never considered that enemies had families. It seemed obvious now, but war had a way of erasing obvious things. "I'm sorry," Billy said. He did not know why he said it. The words simply came. Kenji stared at him for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook and stood. "My name is Kenji Tanaka. I was a literature student. I loved American books. Billy Dawson. I'm a rancher's son. I never read much." They did not shake hands. They did not smile. But something passed between them, invisible and fragile as spider silk. A recognition. A crack in the wall that war had built. 3 days later, Yamamoto attacked a guard with a sharpened spoon. He was subdued, bloodied, and dragged to Colonel Webb's office. Everyone expected execution. Kenji followed at a distance, watching through a window as Webb sat Yamamoto down and spoke to him through an interpreter. The conversation lasted 2 hours. That night, Webb announced that he would investigate the death of Yamamoto's brother. He had connections in the War Department. He would find answers. Kenji returned to his barracks and sat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the Texas stars burned cold and bright. Somewhere across the ocean, his home waited. But here, in this impossible place, something was changing. The enemy had a face now. The enemy had a name, and the enemy was offering water to men dying of thirst. Thunder rolled across the Texas plains like artillery from a distant war. Kenji Tanaka gripped the saddle horn with both hands as his horse charged into the darkness, rain hammering his face, lightning splitting the sky above. Somewhere ahead, 200 cattle were stampeding toward oblivion, and somewhere behind him, a stubborn old rancher was watching his entire livelihood scatter into the storm. It had been 3 months since Kenji arrived at Camp Hearn. 3 months of adjusting to the impossible. The labor shortage that gripped Texas during the war had grown desperate. Young men had gone to fight in Europe and the Pacific. Farms and ranches struggled to survive. Colonel Webb had proposed a solution that made the town of Hearn furious: let the prisoners work. The protests had been loud. These were the men who bombed Pearl Harbor. These were murderers. Monsters. But desperation is a powerful thing, and when ranchers faced losing everything, ideology bent. Work crews began leaving the camp each morning under armed guard. They picked cotton. They built roads. They mended fences. And they earned something no propaganda could erase: grudging respect. Earl Dawson had resisted longer than most. His nephew had died at Guadalcanal. His hatred ran deep and personal. When the first work crew arrived at his ranch, he sat on the porch with a shotgun across his lap and said nothing except to point at the cattle pens. But Earl was also practical. He needed hands. His son Billy was young and inexperienced. The ranch was drowning. Kenji had worked the Dawson Ranch for 6 weeks when the storm hit. It came without warning, a wall of black clouds that swallowed the afternoon sun. The cattle panicked. A fence gave way. And suddenly, decades of Earl Dawson's life were running wild across the plains. Earl mounted his horse and rode into the chaos, screaming commands that the wind stole before they reached anyone. Billy followed, terrified and unsure. The guards hesitated, uncertain of protocol. This was not their problem, but Kenji understood something the guards did not. He had grown up in a fishing village before moving to Tokyo for university. He knew what it meant to watch your livelihood disappear. He had seen his own father lose boats to typhoons, lose nets to storms, lose hope to the cruelty of nature. Earl Dawson was not his enemy in this moment. Earl Dawson was just a man trying to save what he had built. Kenji grabbed a horse from the corral. He had ridden perhaps 3 times in his life, all during the past month. He was terrible at it. But he swung into the saddle anyway and kicked the animal forward. Behind him, Yamamoto shouted something lost in the thunder. Then Yamamoto grabbed a horse too. So did Sato. So did a dozen others. The prisoners rode into the storm. What followed was 3 hours of terror and chaos. Rain blinded them. Lightning struck close enough to smell the burning air. Cattle scattered in every direction, panicked beyond reason. Men who had grown up in Osaka and Tokyo and Kyoto found themselves chasing animals across land that looked like another planet. 3 prisoners were thrown from their horses. One broke his arm. Another cracked 2 ribs. But they kept riding. By dawn, the storm had passed. The sun rose bloody and orange over the plains. And in the main corral, exhausted and mud-soaked, stood 187 head of cattle. Not all of them. But most. Enough. Earl Dawson sat on his horse and stared at the Japanese prisoners slumped against fence posts, too tired to move. His shotgun was back at the house. His hatred was somewhere else too, lost in the storm, trampled by the hooves of animals that did not care about borders or flags or the color of the hands that saved them. Earl dismounted. He walked to Kenji, who was leaning against a post with his eyes closed, breathing hard. Earl stood there for a long moment, saying nothing. Then he took off his cowboy hat, worn and sweat-stained and 30 years old, and placed it on Kenji's head. "You ride like garbage," Earl said. His voice was rough. "But you got guts." He walked back to the house and returned carrying bottles of Coca-Cola, cold from the icebox, one for every prisoner. The men took them with trembling hands. Sato laughed. Then Yamamoto laughed. Then everyone was laughing, and no one knew why, except that they were alive and the sun was rising and nothing made sense anymore. Kenji drank the Coca-Cola slowly. It was sweet and strange and impossibly American. He looked at the hat on his head. He looked at Earl Dawson standing in the doorway of his farmhouse, watching these enemies drink his cola and wear his gift. Something had shifted. Not forgiveness. Not friendship. But something. "Same time tomorrow," Earl called out. "We got fences to fix." Kenji nodded. The war was still raging across 2 oceans. Men were dying by the thousands. But here, in this small corner of Texas, something else was being built. Something that had no name yet, something that felt almost like peace. The news came on a Tuesday morning in August 1945. A single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, another erased Nagasaki. Kenji Tanaka learned that his home city no longer existed while standing in a vegetable garden he had planted 6 months earlier, holding a tomato in his hand, listening to a guard read from a newspaper in broken Japanese that he did not drop the tomato. He did not scream or weep or fall to his knees. He simply stood there, frozen, as the words washed over him like poison. His mother. His father. His younger sister Yuki, who had been 15 when he shipped out and who wrote him letters full of drawings and dreams. The house where he had grown up. The streets where he had learned to walk. The university where he had discovered Hemingway and Steinbeck and fallen in love with a country that was now killing everything he had ever known. Gone. All of it. Gone. The atomic bombs that ended World War II killed over 200,000 people, most of them civilians. The firestorms that followed burned for days. Survivors walked through ruins that looked like the surface of the moon, searching for family members they would never find. Japan surrendered on August 15. Emperor Hirohito addressed his people by radio for the first time in history, his voice thin and strange, telling them to endure the unendurable. At Camp Hearn, the prisoners received the news in different ways. Some wept with relief that the war was over. Some wept with shame that their nation had lost. Some did not weep at all. They simply stared at the walls and waited for whatever came next. Yamamoto found Kenji that evening and asked the question that haunted them all: what do we tell them when we return? That the enemy gave us Coca-Cola while our cities burned? Kenji had no answer. He walked to the far corner of the camp and stood facing west, toward an ocean he could not see, toward a homeland that existed now only in memory. He stayed there until the stars came out, and then he stayed longer. Billy Dawson found him 3 days later, sitting alone in the barracks, packing the few possessions he had accumulated. A notebook full of letters that would never be sent. A baseball glove given to him by a guard who played catch with prisoners on Sunday afternoons. Earl Dawson's cowboy hat, battered and beloved. Billy stood in the doorway, unsure what to say. The war had been won. His side had won. But looking at Kenji now, at the hollow eyes and trembling hands, victory felt like a word that meant nothing. "I brought you something," Billy said. That he handed Kenji a photograph. It showed the Dawson Ranch at sunset, the cattle grazing, the farmhouse glowing warm in the fading light. On the back, Earl Dawson had written 5 words in his rough handwriting: "You are welcome here. Always." Kenji held the photograph like it might shatter. He had been taught that Americans were demons. He had been told they would torture him, mutilate him, make his death a spectacle. Instead, they had given him water on a train. They had let him plant gardens and play baseball. They had handed him a cowboy hat during a thunderstorm and invited him back to work. "I don't understand," Kenji whispered. "Why?" Billy sat down beside him. "My daddy used to say enemies are just friends you haven't made yet. I thought it was stupid when I was a kid." He paused. "I don't think it's stupid anymore." They sat in silence for a long time. 2 young men who should have killed each other. 2 young men who had chosen something else. The transport ship waited at Galveston Harbor. Prisoners filed aboard in long silent lines, returning to a Japan that no longer resembled their memories. Kenji stood at the gangway and looked back at the country that had held him captive for 2 years. He thought about the fear he had carried on to that boxcar. He thought about the water and the baseball and the Coca-Cola. He thought about Billy Dawson's freckled smile and Earl Dawson's gruff kindness and all the small moments that had slowly, impossibly, rebuilt something inside him that the war had broken. An officer stopped him at the gangway. "Remove that hat. It's American." Kenji looked at the officer. He looked at the hat on his head. He thought about his father, who had taught him that honor meant obedience. He thought about Yamamoto, who had wanted to die rather than accept enemy kindness. He thought about everything he had believed before the war and everything he had learned since. "No," Kenji said quietly. "It was a gift." The officer stared. Other prisoners watched. The tension held for a long, breathless moment. Then Yamamoto stepped forward. He was wearing a cowboy hat too, borrowed from a guard who had become something like a friend. So was Sato. So were a dozen others. They stood in a silent line, enemies in American hats, refusing to remove them. The officer said nothing. He turned and walked away. Kenji boarded the ship and found a place at the rail. He watched Texas disappear over the horizon, carrying with him a photograph, a notebook, and a hat that no longer felt foreign. Japan waited ahead, broken and burning and unknown. But he was not the same man who had left. The world had broken him. And in the broken places, something new had grown.